Women's Policy Action Network and the Advocata Institute, I would like to warmly welcome you all to this press conference on unlocking potential, policies for women's economic empowerment. I would like to firstly thank the media representatives and journalists for accepting our invitation and being present for this important discussion. In light of the disproportionate impact of both the pandemic and the economic crisis on women, enhancing women's participation in the workforce is even more critical. The Women's Policy Action Network, supported by the Kingdom of the Netherlands and facilitated by the Advocata Institute, aims to bring about policy reform through advocacy for the economic empowerment of women. It is a network run by individuals who are committed to women's empowerment. Harnessing advocacy, collating research, and identifying key problem areas that will impact the lives of women are a few of the main targets of the Women's Policy Action Network. In particular, the aim of today's press conference is to present a summary of recent research conducted by the Women's Policy Action Network and to discuss the policy reforms recommended for enhancing women's labor force participation and economic empowerment. Ensuring that these policy recommendations translate into real policy action is the ultimate objective of this evening. Joining us today, we have three distinguished speakers. First of all, Dr. Roshan Pereira, Chair of the Women's Policy Action Network, Ms. Shyamali Ranaraja, Attorney at Law, and Ms. Gayanidi Alvis, First Vice Chairperson of the Women's Chamber of Industry and Commerce. The program today will begin with introductory remarks from our three speakers, and afterwards we will open the floor for any questions from the audience. I would now like to invite our first speaker for the day, Dr. Roshan Pereira, to start off the event. Over to you, Dr. Roshan.
Okay. Thank you and welcome to everyone who's here for this press conference. As Ruanka, I think, introduced the objectives, I just want to go through actually why we actually started this Women's Policy Action Network. So it was really, I mean, there are many agencies and individuals working in this space. But we felt that it was necessary to bring everybody into sort of one platform so that we could amplify the voice of all these different agencies in terms of advocating for change and change in terms of women's empowerment and women's engagement in the labor force. And to get any meaningful change, I mean, we also felt that there needs to be change in there needs to be some legislative change, but also, so as a result, we thought there needs to be some kind of bridge between civil society and the legislators, so that we actually propose certain legislative changes and advocate for those in terms of in Parliament. So first we wanted to make some changes in the laws, but I think as important or even more important, to make changes in terms of practices and the kind of mindsets of people in this area. Because I think laws are one thing, you can pass a law, but actually getting it implemented and seeing meaningful change requires mindset change. And that is also one of the objectives of this Women's Policy Action Network. Just to recap, it was to create awareness and provide a strong voice for policy reforms, to create a bridge between Parliament and civil society to implement reforms, and actually to see some actual reduction in the barriers to women's economic empowerment of women. In this light, the Women's Policy Action Network we focused on 6 areas. I mean, there are many areas, but because we were looking mainly at economic empowerment, we focused on 6 areas. One was on the land laws, one was on labor laws, on the unlocking the potential in the digital economy, looking at social infrastructure, because that is well known as a huge barrier for women to actually enter the labor force, uh, looking at barriers faced by women in the informal economy, and also looking at financial inclusion, because when women have greater financial inclusion, that helps them to engage in economic activity. So these are some of the areas that we looked at specifically. So just to give you some motivation as to, so who sort of is part of this Women's Policy Action Network, we have invited the Women's Parliamentary Caucus to many of our events. We have invited representatives from the different ministries, depending on the different issues. So we had from the Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Technology, etc., on different panels to discuss some of these issues. We had representatives from the chamber, because they work with women at the grassroots level, and also civil society, think tanks, and other activists. So just to provide a motivation as to why it is important to increase women's economic participation, we know that women basically, the labor force participation of women in Sri Lanka has stagnated at around 30% for several decades. And when you dig deeper and you see why women, the lack of women in the labor force, one of the major issues that is raised is that, or one of the major barriers really, is that women, they bear the larger, or the burden in terms of household work and care work in terms of care of elderly, care of the young, it disproportionately, the burden falls on the women. And as a result, they end up having to opt out of the workforce. Whereas for men, if you look at why men, when they looked at the reasons why men are out of the workforce, the main reason is really that they are engaged in studies, which is a very temporary thing, because once they finish, then they enter the labor force. So how do you actually, what are some of the barriers that we looked at? So first thing, one area that we looked at was in terms of labor legislation. And there were 2 areas that we focused on. That was on nighttime work and part-time work. And we all know the issues that arise in terms of the women being unable to engage in nighttime work and part-time work. I know some of this has been partly addressed by amendment to the statute, but it does not address all areas or all sectors of the economy. And of course, there are other barriers in terms of, even if you have the legislation is in place, you also need safe and reliable transportation, which is not necessarily followed through on. So you might have your label, you might amend the legislation, but then you also have to have the corresponding infrastructure to enable women to really make use of this relaxation of the labor laws. The second one, of course, is in terms of in terms of part-time work, and there again, because many women, as I said, bear disproportionate burden in terms of household care and care for the household work. Part-time work is something that can, that they are able to, they're more sort of amenable to part-time work, but unfortunately our labor laws are such that they don't favor, or they kind of disincentivize employers from employing people on a part-time basis. So those are some of the things that we also looked at in terms of some recommendations in terms of amending the labor laws to be able to enable more part-time work. Then the other area we looked at was social infrastructure. And there, of course, the key area was in terms of childcare and elderly care. And that's where I spoke of earlier, because there's a huge lack of affordability and access to reliable and quality childcare, and also lack of monitoring of these childcare centers, whatever is set up. So there needs to be some intervention in these areas. And the second one, of course, which is now becoming increasingly a problem in Sri Lanka, is on elder care, because we have a rapidly aging population, and that is going to now become a huge issue for women again being able to go into the workforce. And then, of course, the parental leave. So what are the recommendations? Some of the recommendations we made was in terms of regulating and monitoring childcare services and incentivizing the corporate sector to actually provide private daycares. Of course, as I was talking to Shamali just before this, I mean, this is only going to be limited to, of course, companies that can afford to. But there's a huge number of small and medium enterprises that cannot afford this kind of to set up their own daycare, which means that there needs to be some kind of system in which these daycares can be set up. Similarly with elderly care, and we were also discussing that there's so much of infrastructure that is available, because there are schools being closed down, buildings are basically vacant, and why can't these school buildings be used for either daycares or after school care, and also you can have elderly care as well, because it has a lot of the infrastructure and you really need to put a few things in place. So these are some things that we need to think about and do, because otherwise we're not going to, I mean, there has to be some concerted effort in trying to get these in place. And the other one is, of course, on parental leave, where I think there's some move. Some institutions have moved on this, but there is no, it's not across the board where there is a recognition of parental leave across all institutions. We also looked at, I think I'm not going to go through all the details of everything, so I'll just run through, because I think I've already taken quite a lot of time on that part, but I think that was the most important, because we really were pushing for those labor laws. Unfortunately, we were told, I think there were a lot of consultations in terms of changing the labor laws. Unfortunately, we have not really seen them really being brought out in any kind of meaningful change in the labor, the statutes. And unless we do these, unless we are really serious about getting these changes done, we are going to continue to have the same, the status quo is going to prevail. So I think we really need to push legislators to go all out and have, make these changes, because I think we've been talking about this for way too long. The other one is on informal employment, and I'll quickly go through that. So basically, because there is no real written legal arrangements between the domestic workers and the employers, there has been huge, I mean, they are highly disadvantaged. So there needs to be put in place some kind of formal instrument or formal recognition of domestic workers as one form of employment. They need to be provided even with EPF and ETF if they reach a certain level of the wages. And of course, there needs to be some kind of minimum law and gratuity payments for domestic workers, which is not yet being done. But here again, because domestic workers are so fragmented and there is no collective, they cannot come together to one collective, there needs to be some intermediary agencies that need to push some of these reforms. The next area that we looked at was digital infrastructure. And this came up a lot, I think, particularly during COVID, where there was a huge push because, in-person shopping was not possible. I think there was a lot of um, digital or e-commerce that was taking place. But unfortunately, Sri Lanka does not have some of the infrastructure that is necessary. So one is in terms of access. Yes, in the urban areas, we have good access to internet, and the coverage is fine. But if you go into the rural areas, the coverage is not that great. So how can you have a universal kind of um, digital economy without really including everybody into this space? The other one is, of course, in terms of the digital devices themselves, particularly after we had these import restrictions and import duty increases. They have become highly unaffordable. So again, that is some area that needs to be looked at. And then the whole issue of digital literacy, because even though Sri Lanka has quite high literacy in terms of literacy in terms of writing and numeracy, our digital literacy is really poor, and that is something that has to be improved. So how do we do that? I mean, we basically propose several policy recommendations in terms of improving access, improving affordability, increasing the digital literacy, and of course having these payment systems. So the next one I want to focus on is on financial inclusion, which is kind of linked to digital literacy, because if you look at financial inclusion, you can see that Sri Lankans do have fairly high financial inclusion in terms of having an account, but in terms of the actual use of accounts for payments, for transactions, is very low. So this is something that has been a puzzle really in Sri Lanka. And when this is kind of overall, right? So this is not just only female, this is all, everyone. If you take females, it's even less, which means that females even use the use of these different payment systems or use of accounts is much less. And if you look at the last thing, even use of digital payments, etc., is very low compared to many other countries. But of course, there are other issues in terms of financial inclusion. We know there's a lot of there's abuse in terms of the way of the being preyed on really by lenders who to try to prey on people in terms of taking advantage of them in lending, etc. So there has to be very strict rules in terms of consumer protection to ensure that that kind of predatory lending, etc., does not happen. Then, of course, on the microfinance sector, and I think this is something that was brought up. I mean, there was a microfinance bill that was proposed, of course, that was shut down. But this is one area that really needs focus, because there are a huge number of microfinance women in the microfinance sector, and there needs to be some kind of regulation in this sector. So I'm not going to, because I think I covered some of these things, I'm not going to go into that. And then finally, of course, in terms of land inheritance, and there, if you look at land ownership, I mean, women, anyway, private ownership of land is low, but when you look at the women's, how many women actually own lands, or the land ownership is even less. It's only about 16% of all privately owned land. So there again, of course, this is the old census. We don't know what the latest census findings will be. But here again, and that is because there are various issues in terms of the legislation, which preclude, or not really preclude, but which prevent or hinder women from owning land. And it's not only just the legislation itself, but it's also the practice. So it's even the land, the people who are in the land the district secretaries or in the district secretariats or the Grama Nildari divisions, even the way they practice this is they favor the male either the spouse or the male sibling over the female. So there are several recommendations that we have made. So I will stop there, and I think maybe we can have a discussion with, and maybe you can raise some questions on these, but these were some of the areas that we looked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. I would now like to invite Ms. Shyamali Ranaraja and Ms. Gaini Alvis to take a seat and make their initial statements. Ms. Shyamali Ranaraja will give her statements first and then be followed by Ms. Gaini Alvis. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for my lack of inches, which will prevent you from having a clear view of whatever I'm saying. I hope at least I'm audible. Thank you, Dr. Roshan, for that very interesting presentation, and congratulations to Advokata for initiating this program at a time when gender rights and gender empowerment is being debated very actively. I would like to sort of cherry pick some topics because of the lack of time. Sorry, you have a demonstration of what I just said. So I would like to cherry pick some topics from Dr. Roshan's presentation because of the lack of time, but I feel as a practitioner and as a researcher that these are very important in terms of empowerment of women, especially with regard to labor force participation. Now, despite all the statistics on social achievement by women, Sri Lanka has one of the lowest rates of participation in the labor force by women in South Asia. Roughly around 30 to 35% of women that participate in the labor force, despite high achievements in literacy, empowerment, and other social aspects. One of the factors, as Dr. Roshan pointed out, is the lack of care resources. And this has been demonstrated to be disproportionately affecting women from participating in the labor force. And I'm not too sure that asking employers, especially in the private sector, to provide childcare will answer this because of the fact that a large majority of employers are in the small and medium enterprise category, and also residential requirements, because most of the large employers you're speaking of are located in urban areas, especially in Colombo. And asking a worker, male or female, resident outside of Colombo, maybe a couple of hours away from by bus, to bring a small child all the way to Colombo for child care purposes is non-productive. So we have to look at other alternatives, other models like childcare based in and around the village, which will also be likely to incorporate a model of elder care, because these are the two care responsibilities which are borne very heavily by women. And there are some time use surveys, as well as the Census and Statistics Department has brought out some studies on care responsibilities. This disproportionately affects women. The other one that Dr. Roshan highlighted that I would like to pick on is the maternity benefits structure in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has ratified the ILO Convention on Maternity Benefits, but unfortunately it has been implemented in a way where both in the public sector and the private sector, the entire responsibility falls on employers by way of paid leave. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that women should be denied paid leave, but the problem is that maternity leave is not intended to benefit the mother, but for the child. So it's the right of the child that you're safeguarding through maternity leave and maternity benefits, where the mother is available to provide the kind of care that the child requires. But unfortunately, when you put the entire burden on the employer, there is a disincentive for employers naturally to hire more females because the cost is higher. If you're paying the female worker a full wage while that person is on maternity leave, then you won't hire a replacement worker. In other countries, these benefits are provided through a social security system, which is equitable in terms of contribution. So it's not only those who are married or female workers who are required to contribute, the entire society contributes in some way so that the burden, or rather the commitment, is shared amongst different groups. So this enables longer, better care and more cohesive care to be provided, rather than the employer having to figure out, can I afford to hire another female worker because, oh, she's of a marriageable age, or she has just got married and she's likely to start a family, that is going to impact my ability to get the best out of her, this kind of question. So this is not the fault of the employer, nor is it something that you should discriminate women against, but it's the way in which this the benefit system is structured. Again, Social Security is a problem for women because women can withdraw Social Security benefits in the private sector, because we don't have a pension scheme. We have a superannuation scheme which pays out at 2 points for women, which is touted as an advantage. It's not. One is upon marriage. If you apply within 3 months of the registration of a marriage, having left your employment, you can get your benefits. So you're telling women, hey, you've got married, go stay home and have kids and give up your employment and your right to be re-employed as well, because there is a real barrier to women re-entering the labor force once their immediate childcare burden is done and children are in school. You don't find a lot of employers giving them priority. Why? Because parents' meetings, school development society meetings, school pickup is carried out mainly by women. Go look at any public school or private school for that matter at 1:30 and look at who's there picking up the children from school. Again, as Dr. Roshan said, lack of infrastructure. You cannot have a child get on a public bus and go home on their own. There has to be a parent to pick up. Very often, it's the women who trade off. The second point at which women withdraw from the labor force at the age of 50. EPF benefits can be withdrawn at 55 for males and 50 for females. So women have a pressure immediately upon them, because at 50 you're still having children who need support in terms of education, maybe infrastructure for the house, education needs, marriageable, children of marriageable age. So women immediately face pressure on withdrawing from the labor force at 50, withdrawing their benefits, and it's consumed for family purposes. So you don't have the benefit of that for your retirement. So if your life expectancy is 78 or whatever it is for females in Sri Lanka, you're looking at 28 years with no income support, because re-entering the labor force at 50 or 51 after you have spent your EPF money is even more difficult than returning after you have got your child care responsibilities somewhat lesser. So these are the ways in which society sort of says, oh, we have provided women with better benefits because they can withdraw these benefits at an earlier stage. It's really not. It actually contributes to the precarious condition of women in their old age. And they have to depend on things like the Elders' Care Bill, which forces children to look after women. What about women who don't have children or whose children are not resident here? There has to be a social security system which provides a lifetime of care, and which is not the burden of one party or the other in the employment relationship, that is the employer. The other point that I would pick up from what Dr. Roshan stated was the informal sector, and specifically the domestic workers. Sri Lanka has a fair number of domestic workers, but not that many as before, because there are more avenues for employment. But what work is available is very precarious. Because, mind you, even in 2016, when the Minimum Wage Act was drafted, the government excluded domestic workers from the minimum wage legislation. So minimum wage was not a big deal at that time. In 2016, it was only 13,500 in total. You can't find a domestic for 13,500, that is true. But it's a principle of the requirement that you excluded domestic workers who are largely female in Sri Lanka from a major law, a major development that said that there was finally a minimum wage threshold in Sri Lanka. That speaks volumes, especially for those NGOs, workers, migrant worker organizations who are campaigning for better working conditions for female migrant workers in destination countries. So if you're not providing national minimum wage legislation, paid leave, time off, overtime payments for domestic workers, then how do you demand that destination countries provide those same benefits for our female workers who largely migrate as domestic workers or unskilled or low-skilled workers? So you have this situation where we have just presented a gender equality bill to Parliament, which was struck down by the Supreme Court as being violating the Constitution largely in most of its provisions, which anyone doing a scant reading would have known, because any law student will tell you that Article 12.1 provides for equality, and the way in which this bill was drafted attempted to expand by legislation rights which the Constitution did not grant. So it was going to fail in the Supreme Court because it needs a majority as a constitutional amendment. The Gender Empowerment Bill has gone through, but you have to wonder whether setting up another structure really will impact women, especially when you look at where women reside in Sri Lanka. 80% of our population, or just about thereabouts, is resident in the rural areas. The National Commission for Women and all these structures are located in the capital. So where do women in other locations who suffer discrimination or harassment come for relief? So we have to look at decentralizing these structures, and really empire building is not a thing that you want to look at, especially when you consider how under-resourced most areas are in terms of basic facilities for women. Dr. Roshan picked up on the infrastructure available for women to return home after night work. The Draft Employment Act, which was presented, which we don't know where it is, what stage it is at now. We are told it's with the Draftsman's Department, but we really have no idea of how it has evolved. Provided that the employer should reimburse or make provision to pay female workers who work at night, or male workers, both, by any means of transport that is available at the time. So that means government doesn't provide buses, there are pick-me, so therefore the employer has to bear the cost of the pick-me home or provide transport by way of company-sponsored transport. That's not realistic. So saying that women workers should be able to work at night if they want to, and I fully believe that, is meaningless without providing the kind of infrastructure support. So right through you see a pattern. We have identified the barriers, we have identified the solutions, but the role of the state has been ignored. These are not burdens that you can expect the private sector to pick up, and it is the state that must provide the childcare infrastructure and the general infrastructure such as transport and safe transport. 95% of women report being harassed on public transport during the day. Can you imagine what this would be like at night? So rule of law, law enforcement, infrastructure availability, facilities, care facilities, they all have to come together in order to make sure that more women join the labor force. And if you ask me, why do you want women in the labor force? Because male participation is at saturation points in the most productive age group. It's nearly at 96%. So if you want more workers and the government says, hey, we have to create more employment, we have to get more investors, where are the workers going to come from? The workers have to come from the female labor force, which is now not participating in work. So therefore, you have to create a conducive environment for women to enter the labor force. This is not rocket science. This is basic logical reasoning. So if you do not get the state to put their money where their mouth is, all these gender empowerment bills, gender equality bills, the National Commission for Women are going to be really empty words and empty structures. So I will leave it there for the moment because I think we are running on a very tight schedule, but we'll take questions if there are any later on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think both of you made my life easier, so I don't have to talk a lot. So specifically, I think I'm thankful to for Roshan for inviting me, and especially the Women's Chamber, to be part of it, because I've been part of many of the sessions as part of the WPAN Advocata organized. And I think it's a lot of work has gone into this, a lot of effort, thinking has gone into it. I think what is more important is what she said also, that we need to now really
get on with it and implement it. Laws are good, but we need to really see how do we really change the mindset of people at grassroots levels to really make a difference. And that's what it is. And like what she mentioned as well, I mean, labor force participation is like coming down at a rate, and we don't see any improvement into that. So there are many reasons for that. But how do we really understand exactly why this is the case? There are many reasons, but unless you really change the mindset of people, I mean, at a very, very lower level, we won't be able to get to where we want to come. So I will specifically touch upon the area that was not much talked about, especially the entrepreneur space. As you all know, in the business landscape, 75 to 80% of the businesses are SMEs in this country. Out of that, 25% are only women-owned. So I think that's another area that we need to really work on, because there are a lot of issues that women are faced there as well. I mean, we all know it's a universal thing. Women have issues related to access to finance, access to markets, access to know-how, information and all of that. Those are universal truths, but still, what are we going to do about it is something that we need to understand. So sometimes when a woman goes to get a loan to a bank, like Roshan also mentioned, I mean, it's very difficult, because Women's Chamber, we did some surveys some time ago with few banks, and some of the findings is really alarming, because sometimes some of the questions that they are asking from the women and really puts them off, and they don't really actually are very supportive of the woman to, give a loan for that particular. Of course, I'm not saying on the part of the woman, they also have to have a proper business plan and all of that, but despite having that, you struggle a lot. So what we need to understand is, how do we really make women more enabled, and especially to provide them more opportunities to access finance. And especially, most of the women don't actually own their own land. Land rights is a big issue that also she spoke about. And collateral is a big issue. So then how do you, most of the businesses are run by women, but the business is owned by the husband or the brother or father or something. So that's a big problem. So much so that we have an annual entrepreneur awards. We've made it very clear that if you don't own the business and you don't have proper business registration, that you are not eligible to apply for awards. And we have seen that very encouraging. Some of the wives have actually spoken to the husband and got the business percentage ownership for them as well. So there are things happening. So these are little things that you need to really push. Otherwise, we keep on talking about access to finance is a big issue, collateral is an issue, but then what are we going to do anything about it? So you need to educate women. You need to educate men as well, why we are saying that. So that is an important aspect. See, laws are there, but finally at the end of the day, we need to implement those things and make everybody aware. Awareness is key. So that is what we have felt from the Women's Chamber, because we work a lot with the grassroots levels at different provinces and all of that. And we now see more and more women coming forward. And they are, I mean, when you develop their capabilities and capacity building programs, when we conduct, we realize that they are in a position to understand the issues, and then they actually reach out to the people to ensure that they will also bridge those gaps, knowledge gaps that they have, so that they will manage that. And I don't know, the recent the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, Sri Lanka is precariously placed actually. We are 122 out of 146. And we are, of course, third out of South Asia, but ahead of us is Bangladesh and Nepal. And globally, of course, it will take 132 years to bridge the gender gap. But nevertheless, if you really look at Sri Lanka per se, I mean, despite having free education and free health and all, we are up there. We have higher rankings in those two elements. But if you look at political empowerment and economic participation, we are really way below. So those are areas, especially we know in the parliament also the representation, female representation, I think 8 or 12 now, right? 11 now. So 11. So out of the 225. So you really need women. Of course, Parliamentary Women Caucus is really doing a great job and pushing the on the law. But what is important for us is, how do we really get our voice heard at that level? Because finally they are the ones who will pass all these laws and legislation. So how do we bring all those issues? So in that context, what Advocata is doing, like a kind of a voice pushing our agenda, talking to them about the issues that we have at our hand. At least to some extent, we will be able to push this envelope and achieve something that we can achieve. So what is important for us to understand is, yes, we have a skill migration issue. We have a huge dearth of talent in the market. People are leaving. Like what she said, the only way to tap into that opportunity is through getting into more women, allowing them to get into the world of work. So be it in entrepreneurship, be it in working in an organization, all of that is very important to understand, because finally at the end of the day, there are a lot of conscious and unconscious biases, all of that, but despite all that, if you don't educate the masses, especially at a school level. If you look at a school textbooks, if you look at, right? that you have to start from there. There you show like the mother is cooking in the kitchen, father goes to work or go to the paddy field. So that kind of thing. So from the childhood days, the children think that, okay, mother's place is in the kitchen, not to work. So that kind of mindset change is required. So I think from school level and at a higher level, at all levels, this has to be discussed. But we are encouraged by the government talking about these two bills, but nevertheless, what is important is really going and implementing so that we can have a meaningful change and so that more women can involve in economic participation, so that our numbers can actually go up and it can have a positive impact to our GDP. Yeah.
I would like to thank our three speakers for those very informative remarks. And now we may open the floor to any questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and we will provide you with a mic so that you may direct your question at the panel. Thank you.
So in terms of land ownership, there are certain legislative barriers that currently exist in terms of inheritance of land, because they favor, as I said earlier, they favor the male heir or the spouse. So we have actually provided, we have asked for certain amendments to certain legislation. I don't know whether I want to go through each amendment, but basically some of them are to do with the amendment of legislation. But I think more than that is also this policy reforms in terms of the mindset of people within the Ministry of Lands and the district secretaries, etc. Because even though in some cases there is no discrimination really between male and female heirs, in practice there seems to be a favoring of the male heir. So what we have recommended is that, there is a pother which is used basically in terms of, in many of these land cases, and that basically does not really discriminate. But the way it is worded or the way the language is, the officers seem to assume that it sort of favors the male. So what we're saying is there needs to be much more education and much more awareness in the officers as well, that there is no discrimination in terms of the law. So these are some of the things that we have proposed, and we can share in detail really the policy. We have a policy brief on exactly what are the amendments that we are proposing in terms of some of these legislation. So one is to do with the land ordinance, one is to do with the debt ordinance as well, the debt conciliation ordinance, and the other one is on the rent act. So I can maybe share those with you.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, nobody is requesting that the government commit more funds to social services, but there is a lot of other models available, public-private partnerships. For instance, something as simple as implementing a requirement that all condominiums that are being put up have a dedicated space for childcare would make a huge difference. That doesn't require any new resources on the part of the government, because then the condominium authorities are responsible for providing care. When you ask the employer to provide that care, my problem is there. Who ensures that standards of childcare are monitored? What are the guarantees that there would not be exploitation of children, child abuse? So without the state coming into that responsibility, asking a private institution to provide the kind of care may cause more damage. So that is my problem with that particular aspect of requesting solely private partnerships. But if you have these village-centered models, you already have a village, the Prajasala, the community space already. It requires very little more. And for this, you can get partnerships with employers in the area to create endowments, provide employment for women from that area to work as carers or early childhood development educators, and to provide elders care. You might find elders who are mobile, who are still active, who might be able to provide that kind of care. So a holistic model rather than a sort of top-down, very urban-centered model is what I'm speaking of. And then also the infrastructure. Look at the expressways that are being promoted and touted as, oh, this is for tourism development. You can get from Colombo to Galle in 1 hour. You have to look at how many people this really benefits. Is it worth putting public money into mega infrastructure projects which benefit only all those who already have a vehicle and whose transit time is shortened? But whereas the larger part of the population who don't own their private vehicle have to still take the same old rambling buses or trains which are on strike anyway today. So, that kind of trade-off. So if a parent can get to work from wherever they are by public transport in an hour, which is not possible on an expressway unless you have a private vehicle, and that parent returns home in an hour after work, you would have a better environment for the child. So again, these are prioritizing and targeting. So who decides on priorities for public spending? What role does the public and the civil society organizations have in determining where infrastructure commitments are made? And should we have a better debate on where these projects are located and how prioritization happens? Is a big question. I don't for a moment say that the government should take on more liabilities. We are told that the government doesn't even have budgeted expenditure for certain resolutions to be brought for all the industrial action that is going on. But there are other models, certainly, which would be less burdensome and more beneficial for both children. And if we do not provide these childcare and elderly care opportunities, we will not have employees to service the investment that we are targeting. That is the problem. So because look at the data. Male participation in the labor force is at 96% in some age groups, which is the most productive age groups, whereas female participation is very low in that category. And that is primarily due to the care responsibility. So this is the problem. You're right, but I will let Dr. Roshan take that after this small addition, and I'm sure Ms. Gani also has intervention. But the problem is in the kind of skills profile that we promote. What are the skills available? We promote 12 years of schooling with the target of university admission. Out of a 200,000 student population that sits the advanced level, there are spaces only for 25,000. Should we be looking at a different model at grade 8 or 9 before sitting all these competitive exams which are totally useless in the informal sector? Should we be looking at vocational training for those who want to do that? But we don't have a system like that. Everyone is in this rat race, in this process to get to that very rare university education, which really a lot of people don't really need or want to, but because of the societal pressure, you aspire to that. So I don't really blame anyone at all for providing beauty services if there's a market for it, because we have to go towards a market-driven model. But in terms of enabling skills acquisition, we have a long way to go when it comes to especially female students and the type of skills that we encourage them to acquire. Sorry, Dr.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with all that, and I think that is where we really need a different mindset change, really, in what kind of education that we're promoting from primary school level right up. And the countries that actually have done well in terms of increasing their labor force participation of females have actually started from the education system itself. So I think that, as Shamini said, I think that is the most vital, because I mean, if you look at enrollments in universities, I mean, the female enrollment is higher in most subjects. In some STEM subjects, obviously, not obviously, but the male enrollment is higher. But in most other disciplines, the female enrollment is higher. But then when it comes to actual labor force participation, they drop off, and that's, I think, the many reasons that we've come up with. We've discussed today, and one of the major reasons is actually on care, and this is not really unique to Sri Lanka. You have this in Latin America, you have this in India, you have this in many areas, in other areas as well. But the thing is not to look at where this has failed, but look at countries where they have actually progressed, where they've actually been able to reverse this trend. In Sri Lanka, actually, it's declining. The labor force participation is declining or stagnated. How do we reverse this trend? And I think that's what we need to look at proactively, without, thinking of where we were, and I mean, the fact that we have all these barriers. How do we actually move? And I think we have put forward, and it's not only us, I mean, this is a collective. We have taken research out of, many other agencies that have done research in this area. There are very practical steps that can be done. And just going back to the issue of government, I mean, we're not asking the government to actually put in money necessarily to address some of this. Some of it is just in terms of regulation. Some of it is in just setting up the framework. When you come to, on the child care and the elderly care, there needs to be some kind of regulatory mechanism, because otherwise you'll just have, nobody's going to go into this area, because this is quite a sensitive area. I mean, you do have some elderly care facilities, but not necessarily regulated. So if you want to, we need not just numbers, we also need quality care. And that kind of regulatory framework also needs to come, the government needs to do that. And I think we had someone earlier on one of our panels. We have this local government system. We have the municipal councils, and there's an institutional framework within that, or institutions within that, who can actually do this job. So it's not like we are going to employ new people. There are existing, the existing personnel are within these institutions that who can be trained to actually do this job of, monitoring and ensuring that whatever care facilities that are set up are actually fit for purpose. So I think it's not a case of the spend, but rather where do you allocate the resources to be able to increase the participation of women. Gayani, would you like to add something?
Like what she also said, like we have many women's organizations doing many things, so we all can get a lot of ideas from them, and that's exactly what WPAN is doing. So how do we really harness the potential of all these work that women are doing? Sanadhi, your question regarding why some of the women are not getting into the areas that are considered to be male dominant. I mean, you know, like women in logistics is an area that we have really considerably moved the needle, because we realized that in logistics area we don't have many women. So therefore what we have done is we've just created awareness on the opportunities available. We created a mentoring program. Now we see more women coming in. So it's just a two-way thing. It's not that women are not willing to get into the areas which are so-called male dominant fields, but you need to also create awareness, because as parental pressure is there, they only know what they know about specific standard specializations in or become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, but there are other areas where you have opportunities. I mean, so the women who are already reached the top in those fields can actually, inspire other women, young women to, mentoring them, giving them a helping hand, educate them, and creating opportunities. I think all of us in our own little spaces, we have a huge role to play in there. We can't wait for everything for the government to do. I mean, all of us in our own, within our power, many things can be done. But mindset change, and personally for me also, I'm a strong believer of action orientation. We can talk about it, we can have legislation, but finally if we really don't go to the grassroots and implement this, there is no point. So I think it's important for us to create awareness. Let's not give up. It will take 134 years to bridge the gender gap globally. Are we going to wait for it? No. We have to do something. When there is a gap, there is opportunity for us to do something. So that's what we need to really do. So I think if we really have a focused effort and keep pushing the agenda and pushing the government also, we should be able to at least make some progress in the right direction.
Sorry, I would just like to add one thing very graphically to answer your question about should the government spend on things like childcare. Yes. Think about if the Nelum Kuluna had not been built, you would have been able to build a childcare center fully funded for the next 134 years in every village in Sri Lanka. So prioritizing. And their civil society organizations need to take the blame, because none of these public expenditure projects are questioned at the stage when it can be stopped. There are ways in which you could stop them, Supreme Court action, get a writ, I don't know. But certainly, if you can build something which is of absolutely no use to anybody, certainly you can put your money into infrastructure that actually benefits the population. This is something that I have been stressing, that we make policies and we make decisions on public spending based on those who need it most, not on those who have the most. And if you look at income distribution, it has worsened. I think 1% of the population owns something like 90% of the wealth in Sri Lanka and globally. So we do all this, everywhere it happens, but it's time, if we want to make meaningful change, that civil society stands up and asks for that expenditure to be made based on those who need it most.
It is disappointing, but having said that, we also don't give up. We just keep pushing, but at least some of it getting implemented. I remember in 2016, a task force was appointed by then Prime Minister, the current President, and then we gave some recommendation, and some of it is getting implemented now at least. Better late than never. So that's what I'm saying. So we keep pushing the same agenda. I mean, everybody collectively we keep pushing, and at least now the night work and BPO or whatever that is happening. And also now out of the 16 labor laws, 14 they're trying to bring it under one umbrella. I don't know whether it has gone through the legal draftment and all that, but if it comes through, then again all these three different maternal benefits ordinance, Shop and Office Act, and ILO 183 convention, all three different maternal benefits also will get amalgamated. So all these things will actually, it's just a will of the government. I mean, it's just a matter of getting it passed before the election. I mean, just if you really want to do that, it can be done. Because I think, but at least some progress is made, but we are not really happy that we could have done much more than.
No, I don't think you should feel that,
Yeah.
because they did what was logical, because the constitution is very clear.
Right.
And the bill was drafted, this is my personal opinion, to fail, not to pass. because if you ask one of a junior law student, they would tell you that that language was bound to fail. And you don't really need another gender equality bill. Sri Lanka ratified CEDAW, the Convention against for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, in 1998. We have not implemented that. We are under international law, we are required to bring in legislation to implement that. So they could have used the CEDAW provisions, which already have a precedent. What the Supreme Court said was absolutely correct, that you cannot attempt to amend the Constitution through legislation which is not of the same level as the Constitution, which is 2/3 majority. So the government knew this all along. It was not rocket science, so it was bound to fail. My regret is that it also pushed the agenda for the right to gender identity back by about 20-25 years, because what was earlier by sort of inferred from the opinions given by the AG has now been shut up. The Supreme Court has defined gender as being binary, so male or female. So that has pushed the agenda back. So it has really created a lot of a disservice, because constitutional interpretation is now absolutely clear. So that's what you do when you put half-baked laws before the Supreme Court. You risk getting a really hard decision which you are now bound by. Sorry? No. It was very clear from the Supreme Court decision. It's not ready, it's not legislation ready. And the Supreme Court has said what it has to say in a very hard manner, and you can disagree with that. But the fundamental principle remains. Why would you put something that was bound to fail? Because gender has not been defined. They were very clear. Gender equality has been tried to be smuggled in, which is not in the Constitution.
One last question for me about, thank you. How do you think that getting a social security system is realistic for Sri Lanka in the next 5-10 years or so?
Yes. Some gender equality. What about the other ladies who want to have questions?
We have a question from our online viewers. I would like to direct it to the panel at large. Can you elaborate on the potential impact of public-private partnerships in establishing a professional care industry for both children and the elderly?
Do you want me to take that? Sorry, it's going to be all me for the moment, I think, so please tell me if you had enough of my interventions. But very briefly, yes, there are so many models from the Nordic countries, from Europe, from Australia, where these public-private partnerships have worked very well. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So there are so many things that we can use. Certainly, the government has a role to play, as Dr. Roshan pointed out, in regulating and setting standards and ensuring that those standards are met, because you are talking about children and child rights. And we know that Sri Lanka has a huge problem with regard to child abuse and mismanagement of child care facilities. Well, maybe not huge, I'm going to be quoted, so I better withdraw that one. But some problem, some degree of problem with regard to ensuring that children are protected in care services. So the state has to take the lead for sure, but the private-public partnership, we don't have to decide here and now. There are experts for that. But the recommendations are very clear, that without those care facilities coming in, there is no point talking about increasing female labor force participation.
Any more questions? Oh. No?
Absolutely, because there are, the Tertiary and Vocational Education Commission used to track courses available for students, vocational training courses, and track them into employment. The highest enrollment for male workers were in things like refrigeration technique, refrigeration, air conditioning, things like that, and there was 100% uptake for employment. Female students register mostly for things like data entry, uh, beauty culture, and things like that, where employment rates are much less, something like 63%. NVQ, yes, TBEC. So this is also perception, but there is a reason for that. When there was some survey done previously, now for things like air conditioning, it's not rocket science. Females students are more than capable of doing this. But familial concern is for where they are going to work. They are going to work in male-dominated industries with very few facilities. And also for things like electricians, contractors, people who work on house construction. There's huge demand for qualified persons. Masonry, carpentry, if you establish this at NVQ levels, there's a huge demand. But then when you go into the field, facilities, safety for female students or female workers are non-existent virtually. What about sanitation? It's understood that male workers will creep into the nearest scrub jungle. But if you have female workers, you have to provide adequate and proper accommodation, care, all that. So employers can't do this on their own. So until those infrastructure facilities catch up, parents don't want them to go into this. So you have to find a workable model where even in urban areas, it should not be unusual to see female workers engaging in all these construction activities because they can travel from their residential level. So it's again a case of marketing. But sadly, late Professor Swarna Jayavira did a tracer study on female students after secondary education on what their aspirations were. So Dr. Roshan mentioned doctor, lawyer, engineer, teacher. 28 years later, shortly before she passed away, she repeated the study and the aspirations had remained the same over 2 decades. So you have this societal perception which does not encourage women for whatever reasons, or reasons of culture, or we do not want to be seen as having hard, pushy females who can't be married off, who do not go into this. That's a stereotype, but it is also true. But it is changing slowly. Both. I would say both, because without those facilities, you cannot guarantee the safety of those workers. I mean, you can follow a course in, say, electrical wiring, but if you can't go into a house construction and be safe while you're working, then obviously there is a dissonance there.
What's the take in, for example, if you take Scandinavian countries where the indicators are very high, like on the percentage, if you take like construction industry, male versus female?
I wouldn't know at all, but certainly there is an imbalance, but not as much as this.
Google auto industry in the US, it's only 24%.
Probably, because for the same reasons, because you don't want to work in male-dominated industries for other reasons. I will also tell you, now that we are discussing this, that whenever these issues are discussed, there is a pushback, both from legislators as well as from societies, as being, oh, these are women's issues, and the women are on the warpath again, asking for more rights. We have been campaigning for the ratification of ILO Convention C-190, the Convention on Elimination of Violence and Harassment in the Workplace. It's violence and harassment against any worker, not just female workers, but there has been a huge pushback. And even the Women's Caucus, it's 11-1 now actively. So because of that, even the Women's Caucus has not been able to make headway. And look at what we hear on the news. One of the female legislators was insulted in Parliament, and all the male colleagues defended the perpetrator. And because of parliamentary privilege, you cannot take action for defamation or anything like that. So what is the message that you're giving society? There are this minority group of women in parliament who are abused openly on the floor of the parliament, and that's okay. And then you try to tell a parent, it's okay, send your girl to work in a male-dominated industry, they'll be well looked after. It's not going to happen. So it's time that people also voted for women candidates so that they increase the percentage. The electorate is more than 50% female.
Exactly.
But you return over and over again male candidates. So you have to understand that change must begin with each of us. So women don't vote for women, and that is a reality. That is very true. If they did, of course, you had to nominate women in the first place. And even in the local government, when 25% was reserved for women candidates, you could not find women candidates because nobody wants to stand because of the kind of electoral violence and the kind of cost involved and all that. In my electorate, I mean, I live in the boondocks in Kandy. We had a female candidate, and you know, even the women in the rest of the village wouldn't vote for her because of a personal issue, even though she was a retired midwife and a public health nurse and knew the issues of the village. So even at village level, we have much higher standards for female candidates than for male candidates. Don't ask me who got elected. It will give away exactly where I live, but I can tell you that well, I might as well tell you that it was a soothsayer who didn't even live in the village. So there you go.
But to answer your question, in the Port of Colombo, also there is an unwritten agreement that, okay, women can't work. Yeah, but now we have, so since 2017, I mean, of course, like what she said, we didn't have the necessary infrastructure. Port is a huge area, we don't have proper restrooms and all of that. And that was done. 20 women were trained. Of course, now they've come down. But for the last 7 years or so, we have 10 female gantry crane operators. So, I mean, like, but they are not doing the main, but they are doing the rubber gantry cranes. But of course, it's there. We are the Southeast Asia's first female gantry crane operators. So I think you need to make baby steps. Just think big, make baby steps, but you need to sustain that effort and move forward. I think that's what is important. But the fact that now more and more women are coming out of engineering and all of that, numbers have increased now. I mean, earlier engineering, and I did engineering, so in my time it was a like very small percentage. But now, even in engineering, 34%. So that's quite significant. So like that, now in tech areas also more women are getting in. The only thing is, why are they not coming to the world of work is a challenge. So how do we really fix that problem is something that we'll have to really work on. Exactly. Yes.
Okay. If you don't have any more questions, maybe we can wrap up. So I just want to impress upon us all, actually, Sri Lanka is coming out of one of the worst crises. We have a huge labor issue because we've got an aging population, we have migration. As Shamli said, I mean, the male labor force participation is reaching saturation in some areas. So it is absolutely essential that we utilize this underutilized resource that we have. We have more than 50% of the population are female. It's a highly underutilized resource. We really need to put that resource into use. But how do we do that? I think we've kind of discussed some of the barriers. We really need to be serious about addressing those barriers. And I would really impress upon the media that, I mean, we need to take this message out. We need to keep this message on the table, because I think we had a huge sort of impetus earlier in the year, but now, you know, we get sort of, it gets diluted by other messages. And now I think we've got a good opportunity, because I think a lot of political parties will be putting out their manifestos to ensure that some of these issues are put on the table, so that we can make sure that these actually get done whenever new governments are in place. So I think that is a message I have. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you to speakers as well for accepting our invitation. I think there are some refreshments outside, so maybe we can continue the conversation out there. Thank you.